Humanity stood on the brink of greatness, yet remained anchored to its own planet, trapped in a web of limitations that no one seemed able to break. The stars beckoned in distant whispers, but Earth was far from reaching them. The most advanced species in the galaxy had mastered intergalactic travel, while humans barely managed to send probes beyond their own solar system. The thought of faster-than-light travel was dismissed as a dream, a fantasy impossible to achieve, and in the shadows of these doubts, Olivia Ward sat in her small lab, surrounded by piles of notes and equations, her hands trembling as she reviewed a paper that seemed more like a riddle than a solution. She had studied the works of physicists before her, the brilliant minds of the galaxy, who had spent centuries refining their theories only to find themselves hitting an invisible wall. Olivia refused to accept that wall. It was not that the universe was incapable of bending, but that the answers had not yet been found, and she was determined to be the one to uncover them. She knew that the path to something so extraordinary would be paved with rejection, but she felt the fire of her belief burn brighter than all the discouragements that surrounded her. She believed that humanity had the potential to change the course of the stars, even if the universe itself scoffed at the idea. For years, Olivia had been studying the phenomenon of space-time warping, but her ideas were met with ridicule from established physicists. They called her theories unworthy of attention, nothing more than a mathematician's folly. But there was something in her mind, a spark that others failed to see. Her hypothesis suggested that the laws of relativity were not unbreakable, but merely misunderstood. She believed that if they could manipulate gravity in specific ways, they could stretch the fabric of space itself and slip through its folds with unimaginable speed. Still, no one took her seriously, and even her colleagues turned their backs on her one by one. She watched as her dreams seemed to disintegrate before her eyes, and yet Olivia refused to relent. The ridicule only made her resolve stronger. The universe was vast, and humanity was young, but that didn't mean they couldn't have a place among the stars. She could feel it in the depths of her soul that they were meant for more. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. One late evening, while she pored over the numbers once again, something caught her eye, an anomaly. In the calculations, it wasn't much, but it was enough to make her heart race. She had stumbled across a pattern, something that suggested it was possible to warp space-time in a controlled manner. It was the missing piece, something no one had seen before. Her mind raced as she ran the equations again and again, confirming the result with each pass. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had done it. She had found the solution to faster-than-light travel. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was real. She had no time to waste. The galaxy might never believe her, but she was sure of one thing: humanity would not be left behind. They would defy the impossible, no matter the cost. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the calculations. The numbers weren't just an anomaly. They were the key to something far greater than herself, something that could change the fate of her entire species. With trembling fingers, she began to jot down a plan to test her hypothesis. She had no time to waste. She needed to act before the scientific community could dismiss her again. The clock was ticking, and she couldn't afford to wait for their approval. The first step was simple yet daunting. She had to find a team, people who believed in her vision, those who would follow her into the unknown, and together they would build the first warp drive humanity had ever known. She sent out feelers to a few trusted colleagues. Most of them had already laughed her out of their labs, but Olivia had a few allies left, some who saw beyond the established norms and were willing to take a leap of faith with her. There was Marcus, a former aerospace engineer, whose curiosity was only matched by his defiance of conventional thinking, and Mara, a computational genius who could crack the most complex algorithms in seconds. They were the first to respond the moment they saw the data. They were hooked. They had no reason to believe in the impossible, but they trusted Olivia enough to help her try. The next challenge was far greater than just gathering a team. It was getting the resources they needed to build something that no one had ever dared attempt before. The costs were astronomical, and the risks unimaginable. The powers that controlled funding for space exploration refused to even consider such a project, and every time Olivia tried to reach out to larger organizations, she was met with rejection and doubt. But Olivia was relentless. She had seen the potential, and she couldn't back down. She knew that if she could prove the concept even once, humanity could take the first step toward the stars. So she turned to the only place that might understand the magnitude of her work, a small group of private investors with a track record of funding bold and unconventional projects. They were as much a risk as they were a potential lifeline. But Olivia took the chance, and it paid off. Within weeks. She secured enough funding to establish a small facility where her team could begin their work. The lab was a far cry from the high-tech spaceships of the galaxy's elite, but it would do for now. With each piece of equipment they gathered, the dream began to feel more tangible, more real. And though there were still those who doubted them, Olivia felt something stir within her, a certainty that she couldn't explain. No matter how many obstacles they faced, no matter how many times they were turned away by the world around them, she knew they were on the brink of a discovery that would rewrite history. The team worked tirelessly, sometimes going days without sleep, as they constructed the first prototype of the warp drive. Every day brought new challenges, but with each hurdle they overcame. The vision became clearer and clearer, but there was still the looming question: what if they failed? What if the universe was right, and the laws of physics truly were unbreakable? What if they risked everything only to watch it all fall apart? But Olivia refused to let fear control her. If they succeeded, they would change the galaxy forever, and if they failed, they would at least know they had dared to try. And that was enough to keep her going, even as the world outside seemed content to leave them behind. The prototype began to take shape in the cluttered lab. As Olivia and her team worked with a single-minded determination, they were building something the galaxy had thought impossible, something that could tear apart the boundaries of space itself. At times the task seemed overwhelming, but each moment of progress fueled their belief they were on the verge of history. Marcus and Mara had become more than colleagues. They were allies bound by a shared vision. Even when doubt crept in at the edges of their minds, they pushed it away together. They moved forward. There were setbacks, of course, moments when the calculations didn't add up or the energy readings spiked far beyond safety limits. But they were undeterred. The breakthroughs came slower than Olivia had hoped, but with each failure came a new understanding of the warp drive's potential. At the center of it all was Olivia, who had become a beacon of hope for the team. They relied on her relentless optimism and unyielding focus to keep moving forward. When things looked impossible, it was Olivia who reminded them that failure was merely a stepping stone, not an end, but a beginning. Soon the final piece of the prototype was ready. It was time for the first test flight, but there was an undeniable sense of fear in the air. No one could deny the risk of the experiment. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. The ship itself was little more than a test platform, barely capable of handling the immense strain that would be placed on it. Still, they had no choice. They had come too far to back out now. Olivia stood at the control panel, staring at the small vessel below her, heart racing, as she thought of all that was at stake. The ship was nothing compared to the vast ships of the galaxy's advanced civilizations. It looked like something a child would play with, but it held the future of humanity within its hull. She turned to Marcus and Mara, who were both standing by their respective consoles. Both of them appeared calm, but Olivia could see the nervous energy that filled the room. None of them knew what to expect. When the engines fired, would they vanish into the folds of space? Would they tear a hole in the universe itself? The unknown stretched before them, a vast and terrifying chasm. But they had no choice. The world would either recognize them as visionaries or condemn them as fools. She checked the readings again. Everything was in place. With one last glance at her team, she nodded and pressed the button. The ship's engines hummed to life, a low rumble that reverberated through the lab. The moment felt unreal, almost dreamlike. But it was happening. The ship began to glow as the warp field began to form around it. The fabric of space bent in ways that no one had ever seen before. The ship rose from the platform, hovering above the ground. For a split second, the air seemed to warp and ripple. Then the ship was gone, swallowed up by the swirling vortex of energy that enveloped it. For a moment Olivia was sure her heart had stopped. Was it real, or had they failed? Was it over already? And then, just as quickly as it had vanished, the ship reappeared. With a sudden jolt, it reappeared far from where it had been. The sensors confirmed it. The ship had traveled light years away in the blink of an eye. They had done it. Humanity had just completed the first faster-than-light travel. The impossible had become possible, and everything had changed forever. But the victory was bittersweet. As Olivia stared at the data, her eyes widened. The readings were far from normal. Something was wrong. They had crossed a line that even she had not anticipated, and the consequences were about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The room was silent as Olivia stared at the data flashing across the screens. The ship had vanished into the rift of space and reappeared light years away. But the readings didn't match anything they had expected. The energy signatures were unstable and far stronger than anticipated. The warp field had been pushed beyond its limits. The ship was intact, but something about the way it had interacted with the fabric of space-time seemed wrong. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She had expected challenges, but not this. The team gathered around the monitors, each of them tense and uncertain. It was supposed to be a success, but now there was a sense of dread in the air. "Olivia, what's happening?" Marcus's voice was quiet yet filled with concern. He knew something was wrong too. "I don't know," Olivia replied, her voice steady, though inside she was anything but calm. The data was a mess, but she could sense the potential for something more beyond the immediate chaos. The ship had traveled farther than any human vessel had ever gone, yet it seemed to have touched something deeper, something that could change everything. She turned to Mara, who had been scanning the anomaly from every angle. "What do you see?" Mara's fingers flew across her console as she analyzed the data. "There's a ripple in the space-time continuum. It's like we've opened a doorway to something else, but we don't fully understand it yet. There's no telling what kind of effects this could have on the universe itself." Olivia frowned. She had hoped the test would be straightforward, but now the question wasn't just whether they could travel faster than light, it was whether they could survive the consequences of doing so. The unknown stretched before them, and Olivia had no way of knowing what dangers lurked in the wake of their experiment. "We need to run more tests. We can't afford to ignore this. We've already taken the first step. We have to control this, or it'll control us." As Olivia spoke, the door to the lab opened abruptly, and one of the security personnel stepped inside, his face pale with worry. "Dr. Ward, you need to see this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. Without waiting for a response, he turned and led the way to the main control room outside the lab. Olivia and her team followed closely behind. The moment they stepped inside the room, Olivia saw what had the security officers so rattled. On the large screen were images of the outside world, but something was wrong. The sky above the facility was flickering, as if reality itself was glitching. A swirling energy seemed to pulse across the atmosphere like waves on an ocean, but they were moving too fast to be natural. It was as if the universe itself was warping in response to the warp drive's test. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice low with disbelief. Olivia's stomach dropped. "We've disturbed something we shouldn't have," she muttered under her breath. The warp drive had breached a barrier, but instead of opening the door to the stars, they had awakened something much darker. Before she could say more, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The lights flickered, and the alarms blared throughout the facility. The team scrambled to stabilize the systems, but the tremors continued to shake the walls, as if something massive was shifting just beyond the horizon. They were no longer alone in this stretch of space, and whatever had noticed them wasn't pleased. "Brace yourselves," Olivia commanded as she ran back to the lab. "We need to figure out how to close this rift before it gets worse." The mission had just taken a terrifying turn, and Olivia realized they weren't just testing warp drives anymore. They were facing something far more dangerous, something that would test humanity's survival itself. The tremors grew stronger as the lights flickered again in rapid succession. The air was thick with tension as Olivia and her team scrambled to stabilize the facility's systems. Nothing was going as planned. The warp drive's test had opened a rift in space-time, but it seemed they had disturbed something far more dangerous than they could have anticipated. As the reality around them continued to warp, the distant hum of the energy field outside seemed to grow louder and more erratic. It was as if the universe itself was reacting to their trespass. Olivia's mind raced as she analyzed the situation, trying to piece together the broken data streams coming from every angle. Mara was already working tirelessly at her station, her fingers moving in a blur as she typed frantically. "Olivia, I'm detecting some kind of signal coming from the rift. It's faint, but it's growing stronger every second," Mara said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "Signal," Olivia repeated, her mind struggling to catch up. "A signal from what?" "I don't know," Mara replied. "But it's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not just electromagnetic or gravitational. It's something else." A chill ran down Olivia's spine as she realized what this meant. Whatever had been disturbed wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was an intelligent presence, something that had been hidden beyond the rift. Perhaps for millennia, she had feared that their experiment might cause a catastrophic failure, but this went beyond what she had imagined. "Can you trace it?" Olivia asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "I'm trying, but it's coming through in fragments. I think whatever it is has noticed us." Mara's words sent a cold shock through the room. Olivia turned to Marcus, who had been pacing nervously. "We can't let it spread. We need to close the rift now before this gets out of hand." "But how do we close it?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with frustration. "We've just opened a door to the unknown, and now we're supposed to shut it." "We have to," Olivia said with urgency. "Whatever we've unleashed has the potential to tear apart everything we know, and the longer the rift stays open, the more damage it can cause." The room was quiet for a moment as the weight of the situation settled over them. But Olivia wasn't about to give up. They had come too far to let this be the end of it. They had broken through the walls of reality itself, and they couldn't just walk away from their creation, no matter how dangerous it had become. "We'll use the warp drive again," Olivia said firmly. "We'll reverse the polarity of the field and try to collapse the rift from the inside out." Mara looked up from her console, her face pale. "Are you sure that's even possible?" "It's our only shot," Olivia replied, her voice resolute. "We don't have time to figure out anything else." As the team worked quickly to recalibrate the ship's warp systems, the outside world continued to warp and flicker. The sky above the facility, a strange mix of colors and patterns that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. They could no longer ignore the fact that whatever was beyond the rift was growing restless, and their time was running out. The ship was ready again, the energy readings flashing across the screens as the drive powered up. But just as they were about to initiate the reversal, the ground shook violently, and the facility was plunged into darkness. Olivia's heart pounded as she realized with a sinking feeling that they were not alone. A voice echoed through the air, a sound that was neither human nor anything she could comprehend. It was deep, ancient, and filled with a raw power that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. They had awakened something that was far beyond their understanding, and now they would have to face the consequences. The darkness was suffocating as the rumble of the tremors subsided into an eerie stillness. Olivia could feel her heart racing in her chest. The voice that had echoed through the facility wasn't human. It was something far older, something from beyond the known reaches of space. And it wasn't just a distant sound. It was alive, pulsing with a dark presence that filled the room with a strange weight. The air itself seemed to bend around them, as if the fabric of reality was being stretched thin. Olivia turned toward her team, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They had heard it too. Mara's hands hovered over her console, frozen in place. Marcus was gripping the edge of his station, his knuckles white, as he tried to process what had just happened. Olivia swallowed her fear and took a deep breath. Her mind raced through the possibilities. They had opened a doorway to an unknown realm, but whatever was on the other side wasn't welcoming, and it was clear they were no longer in control. "We have to act now," Olivia said, her voice steady though her stomach churned with dread. "We can't let whatever is out there cross into our world." Marcus nodded grimly. "We need to close the rift before it fully destabilizes, or worse, before whatever that thing is comes through." Mara glanced at the readings on her console and then back at Olivia. "I don't think we can close it with the same method we used before. The energy signatures are fluctuating too wildly now. I'd never seen anything like this. The rift isn't just an opening in spacetime. It's a tear in the very fabric of reality itself." The words hit Olivia like a punch to the gut. She had feared something like this might happen, but hearing it confirmed made the reality of their situation all the more terrifying. She had always known that their experiment was dangerous, but this was beyond anything they could have predicted. "We have to try something else," Olivia said. Thinking quickly, "We may need to reverse the polarity in a way that'll force the rift to collapse from the inside out, but we'll have to channel the energy through the core of the warp drive itself. Use it like a stabilizing force to counteract whatever is feeding into the rift." Marcus shook his head. "That's going to be risky. We're not even sure the core can handle that kind of energy. It could tear the ship apart and take this entire facility with it." "I know," Olivia replied. "But we don't have a choice. We can't just sit here and wait for it to get worse. Whatever's on the other side won't stop until it gets what it wants." The team worked in a whirlwind of motion as they rushed to reconfigure the ship's warp drive systems, each of them aware that they were playing with forces that no one had ever controlled before. With every passing moment, the rift seemed to grow stronger. The energy field outside the facility pulsed like a living thing. It was as if the very stars themselves were responding to the presence beyond the rift. Olivia stared at the readings on her own console, trying to steady her breathing. "We're ready," she said, her voice tight with fear, but also determination. Initiating Phase 1 of the collapse protocol. Mara quickly entered the final command sequence, and the ship's engines roared to life. Once more, a blinding light filled the room as the warp field began to form around the ship. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Olivia could feel the weight of their decisions pressing down on her, but there was no turning back now. As the energy surged through the core, she braced herself for what would come next. The ground trembled once again, but this time it was different. It was as if the entire facility was being pulled toward the rift itself. The sky outside had turned a sickly shade of purple, the rift now an ever-expanding vortex that threatened to consume everything in its path. And then, just as Olivia's heart threatened to leap from her chest, something gave way and a violent shockwave erupted from the rift, knocking everyone off their feet. The ship shook violently as the power surged through the systems, and the very air around them began to distort. It was clear now that whatever had been awakened would not go quietly. They had awoken a force far greater than themselves, and now the battle for survival had truly begun. The shockwave slammed into the ship with enough force to rattle every bone in Olivia's body. The lights flickered violently before plunging them back into darkness. The entire facility groaned, as if it were a living thing struggling to hold itself together. The rumble of collapsing systems filled the air, punctuated by the frantic beeping of alarms, as the warp drive's energy began to spike dangerously once more. Olivia forced herself to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to steady her breath. The rift outside had only grown more unstable. The pulsing energy now felt like it was reaching into the very core of the facility. It was as if something immense was trying to break through, and it wasn't going to stop until it succeeded. "Mara," Olivia shouted over the deafening noise. "Status report." Mara was at her console again, but her hands trembled as she tried to keep the ship's systems from failing. I can't stabilize the field. It's pulling too much energy. We're barely holding on here. We need to shut it down, or it's going to destroy everything." Olivia's stomach sank as she realized the truth of what was happening. The rift wasn't just a portal. It was a direct link to something else, to some ancient force that was now reacting to the warp drive's intrusion, and it was more powerful than anything they had encountered before. "Shut it down now," Olivia commanded, her voice tight with urgency. "If we don't close the rift, we won't make it." Marcus finished for her, his face ashen, as he gripped his console and tried to keep the facility from collapsing around them. "If we don't stop this, it'll tear through the entire system and spread beyond us." But the truth was they didn't know how to stop it. They had no backup plans, no contingency for dealing with something of this magnitude. They had tried everything they knew, and yet it seemed as if the very fabric of reality itself was being stretched too thin. "Hold on," Olivia said through gritted teeth as she frantically searched for another solution. "We've been focusing on the wrong thing. The rift isn't the enemy. It's a doorway. We have to take control of it. We can't fight it with force. But if we can reverse the energy flow, it might close on its own. Mara looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. You think we can reverse the flow of energy from the inside? After what just happened? Yes, Olivia replied without hesitation. We can't keep fighting it, we need to redirect the energy. If we can use the warp drive to harness the rift's power instead of feeding into it, we can collapse it from the other side. But we have to act quickly. The seconds felt like hours as the team scrambled to prepare for the next phase. They reconfigured the warp drive to draw the energy from the rift. Rather than continue to feed into it, Olivia could feel the weight of time pressing down on her. They were on the edge of disaster, and they had no way of knowing whether this new approach would even work. Get ready, Olivia said, her voice sharp with focus. On my mark, we'll engage the polarity shift and redirect the flow of energy from the core to the rift. We have no margin for error. The ship trembled again, the rift outside now a swirling mass of energy that threatened to devour everything in its path. The air crackled with tension as they prepared to make their final attempt. The seconds stretched into eternity as they initiated the sequence. The warp drive came to life. Once more, a blinding light filling the ship as the energy from the rift surged through the system. But this time it was different. The energy didn't spiral out of control. Instead, it was drawn into the core. The ship hummed with a deep resonance as it began to redirect the flow. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the air in the rooms seemed to settle. The rift outside flickered and pulsed as the ship's core fought to hold the energy steady. For a moment, it seemed as if nothing would happen. The rift remained open, a swirling vortex of colors and power. But then slowly, ever so slowly, the edges of the rift began to close in on themselves. A deep, rumbling sound vibrated through the facility, and the ship shuddered violently as the energy reached a critical point. And then, with a final pulse, the rift collapsed in on itself. With a deafening roar, the rift vanished, leaving only a faint ripple in the air where it had once been. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air around them seemed to stand still, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire universe was holding its breath. Olivia stood motionless, her hands trembling slightly as the final readings flashed across her console. The rift was gone. The energy that had once surged through the facility was now gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Did we do it? Marcus asked, his voice a strained whisper, his eyes wide as he stared at the empty space on the screen where the rift had once existed. Olivia's fingers hovered over the console, her mind racing through the data. There was no anomaly, no strange readings. Everything seemed normal, too normal. Her heart hammered in her chest, uncertain whether this was relief or the calm before another storm. I think we did, Olivia replied, her voice hoarse, still processing what had just happened. The ship was stable, the facility's systems were coming back online, and the warp drive's core was no longer spiking with dangerous energy. The universe, for the moment, seemed to have returned to its natural state. But the question lingered, at what cost? Mara looked up from her own console, her face pale but filled with cautious hope. We closed it. We actually did it. Not without consequences, Olivia muttered under her breath, the weight of what they had experienced pressing on her shoulders. The ship's systems were running fine now, but there had been a price. The very fabric of reality had been stretched, and for a brief moment, they had played with forces beyond their comprehension. The consequences of their actions were still unknown. They all exchanged silent glances. What had they just unleashed? What had they learned, and at what cost? But before any of them could say more, the loud beeping of a new alert cut through the room. Olivia, we're getting a transmission, Mara said, her fingers flying across the console as she brought the signal up. The transmission was faint but unmistakable, an incoming message from an uncharted source. Who would be sending us a message now? Marcus asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Olivia turned her attention to the screen as the transmission cleared. The source was identified as an unknown vessel, deep in a sector they had never ventured before. The words on the screen made her blood run cold. Humanity, we have seen your actions, and we are coming. The message was chilling, filled with an ancient, almost mechanical tone. It didn't take long for Olivia to realize what this meant. The forces beyond the rift had not been silent observers. They had watched, and now they were aware of humanity's existence. "We've made contact," Olivia whispered, her voice low and filled with awe. Whether we were ready or not. The implications of the message sank in. They had discovered the warp drive, shattered the boundaries of space-time, and perhaps, unknowingly, signaled their arrival to beings far more advanced than they could fathom. "We've opened a door we can't close," Marcus said quietly, his eyes fixed on the screen. Olivia looked around at her team, their faces a mixture of relief, fear, and curiosity. They had won the battle. But now, they faced the reality of the consequences. Whatever humanity had unleashed was far beyond their control. But this was only the beginning. In the silence that followed, Olivia felt an overwhelming sense of both terror and excitement. The universe was no longer an unknown expanse for them to conquer. It was a place filled with answers and dangers that they had only begun to touch. They had defied the impossible, but now they had to face the unknown, and humanity's true journey had only just begun.